I've started the recording.
اوكي. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يقيم قسم علم الآثار في كلية الآداب جامعة المثنى ورشتها العلمية الموسومة إنانا ودوموزي رؤية في الأساطير المعقدة، وذلك في يوم الجمعة الموافق 9/4/2021 الساعة 8 مساء، وعلى منصة برنامج زوم. وقسم علم الآثار داب على إقامة هذه الورش العلمية في استضافة الأستاذ الزائر من الجامعات العالمية، وذلك من أجل التعاون العلمي ومن أجل توفير المعلومة القيمة إلى طلبتنا وإلى الطلبة والباحثين العراقيين. السادة الحضور مع حفظ المناصب والألقاب، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في رحاب قسم علم الآثار في كلية الآداب جامعة المثنى، واسمحوا لي أن أرحب بالسادة الضيوف الأجانب. Let me to welcome. I would like to express my deep gratitude to Assistant Professor Dr. Jana Matuszak to her agreement for our invitation to give seminar entitled Inanna and Dumuzi, Insighting into a Complex Method. Also, my thanks go to all colleagues who attended our seminar for this night. Dr. Mark Widin and Dr. Maurizio Viano and Dr. Bernhard Schneider and Dr. Abdullah Khorshid and all my colleagues that I don't know what other come here. And سأقدم ملخص عن السيرة الذاتية إلى الدكتورة جانا ماتوشاك. دكتورة جانا ماتوشاك وهي باحثة في الدراسات المسمارية، وفي عام 2013 حصلت على شهادة الماجستير في علم الدراسات المسمارية وآثار الشرق الأدنى ودين المقارن من جامعة تيوبنگن ألمانيا. وفي عام 2017 حصلت على شهادة الدكتوراه في الدراسات المسمارية جامعة تيوبنگن ألمانيا، وكانت عنوان أطروحتها عن المرأة والدراسات في الخلافات الأدبية السومرية بين النساء. في عام 2014 إلى 2018 كانت باحث مشارك في مشروع أدبيات الخلاف في الشرق الأدنى القديم بمشاركة البروفيسور الباحث الرئيسي وهو الدكتورة كاثرين ميتلماير من جامعة جنيف في سويسرا. عام 2015 إلى 2018 كانت باحث وتدريسي في جامعة جانا ألمانيا ومساعد قيم مع مجموعة البروفيسور هيلبرت للآثار البابلية جامعة جانا ألمانيا. وفي عام 2018 إلى 2020 محاضر في دراسات الشرق الأدنى القديم جامعة سوأس جامعة لندن في المملكة المتحدة، وحاليا أستاذ مساعد في قسم الشرق الأدنى والدراسات المسمارية في جامعة تيوبنگن في ألمانيا 2021. مقدمة عن المحاضرة ستكون في اللغة الإنجليزية، وسيكون هناك ملخص في نهاية المحاضرة من أجل كسب الوقت. المحاضرة تتمحور حول الإله إنانا، وكما تعرفون الآلهة إنانا هي آلهة في بلاد عبدت في بلاد الرافدين القديمة، والمرتبطة بالحب والجمال والجنس والخصوبة والحرب، وكذلك العدالة والسلطة السياسية. كانت تعبد في الأصل في سومر، وعبدها لاحقا الأكديون والبابليون والآشوريون تحت اسم عشتار. كانت تعرف باسم ملكة السماء، وكانت لها معبد إنانا في مدينة الوركاء التي تقع في محافظة المثنى، والتي كانت لها مركز عبادة رئيسية. قد ارتبطت بكوكب الزهرة، وكان من أبرز رموزها الأسد والنجمة ذات الثمان نقاط. كان زوجها هو الإله دموزي المعروف لاحقا باسم تموز، وأصبحت بما بعد الإله الذكر بابا سوغال. أيضا دموزي عرف لاحقا بالإله اسمه البديل بتموز، وهو إله قديم مرتبط بالرعاة في بلاد ما بين النهرين، وكان القرين الأول للآلهة إنانا التي عرفت فيما بعد باسم عشتار. وسميت شقيقة تموز بالأساطير السومرية باسم كشتن أنا، وهي آلهة الزراعة والخصوبة وتفسير الأحلام. أدرج دموزي في قائمة ملوك سومر بصفته ملكا لمدينة بات تبيرة، وبات تبيرة من المواقع الأثرية التي تقع في محافظة ديقار في قضاء الشطرة، وهذه من المدن التي سبقت الطوفان، بالإضافة إلى كونه أحد الملوك الأوائل لمدينة الوركا. ذكرت القصيدة السومرية إنانا بأنه مزارع، وكان هناك منافس بين دموزي والفلاح أنكيميدو بهدف الفوز بإنانا. وذكرت قصة نزول إنانا إلى العالم السفلي، فشل دموزي في الحداد على وفاة إنانا، لكن إنانا سمحت لشياطين قالا بسحبه إلى العالم السفلي، وأيضا عودته من العالم السفلي. وأيضا أصدرت فيما بعد قرارا لأن يقضي دموزي نصف العام في العالم السفلي والنصف الآخر برفقتها، بينما تصدر قرار آخر بإبقاء شقيقته كشتن أنا في العالم السفلي بدلا منه، بالتالي تستمر دورة الفصول. الآن نستمع إلى دكتورة جانا ماتوشاك، وهي تقدم لنا السيمينار. وشكرا جزيلا. دكتورة جانا, here you are. You can start.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would really like to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Abada for the kind invitation and for the very kind introduction as well. I'll now start sharing my screen. There we go. I hope you can see what I can see now. I take that as a yes, and I'll start. We possess a really extraordinarily rich and diverse textual documentation about Inanna and Dumuzi, ancient Mesopotamia's most famous or perhaps infamous divine couple. Mention of the two deities can be found in nearly every genre, and the texts have piqued the interest of scholars and non-scholars from the very moment they were discovered. As regards Inanna, she is undoubtedly the most complex deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon, and as regards Dumuzi, his identification with the biblical Tammuz, as well as James George Fraser's so-called dying gods, Attis, Adonis, and Osiris, have ensured a persistent interest in his figure. So although much has been written about Inanna and Dumuzi, it may still be worthwhile to present an overview over the textual sources and comment on the various issues that are connected to them. Different approaches to in presenting the material are conceivable. One approach could be by genre, which would allow us to focus on the underlying mythology. There we go. One could tell the Inanna Dumuzi love story as it can be reconstructed from cultic songs evoking their early happy days as young lovers, and then go on to rituals in which the two are presented as the iconic married couple, before we turn to narrative compositions or myths which focus on Dumuzi's death, ending with lamentations which mourn Dumuzi's disappearance and abduction to the netherworld. However, such an approach would obscure the fact that the texts belonging to these major genres are not distributed very evenly over the 3,000 years of Mesopotamian history, To the contrary, several texts which you see here on the slide are only attested in specific periods, specific historical periods. And in adopting a chronological approach, it becomes possible to observe certain trends, changes, and developments in beliefs and cultic practices across time and space. 30 minutes are not enough to present an exhaustive survey of all the texts known to date, and it's equally impossible to do complete justice to all the previous scholarship on the topic. What I will attempt to do instead is to use a very selective overview over textual sources as a backdrop to raise questions about written versus oral transmission, official cult versus popular religious practice, etc. And in order to delimit the scope of my presentation further, I will mainly focus on the evidence from the 3rd and early 2nd millennium and comment on the later periods only in passing. Before I start my survey, let me briefly outline some of the premises on which both my survey and my comments will be based. I think Inanna Ishtar, the Mesopotamian goddess of love, sexuality, and war, is known to everyone. However, I think I need to define my understanding of the figure of Dumuzi. While early scholarship considered Dumuzi one of the oldest and most important deities of Mesopotamia, current consensus holds that Dumuzi is in origin most likely a deified early ruler. This was first proposed by Adam Falkenstein in the 1950s, introducing an important shift in paradigm. Manfred Krebernick has since demonstrated that both his most common names, Dumuzi and Ama Ushumgal, correspond to very common types of Sumerian personal names in the early and mid 3rd millennium BCE. And Jakob Klein has collected references to Dumuzi's human or mortal origin, both in Sumerian narrative and cultic texts. Dumuzi's originally human nature finds an echo in the inclusion of 2 rulers called Dumuzi, there we go, in the ante and immediately post-Diluvian sections of the Sumerian king list, and possibly also explains why rulers of the Ur-3 and Eastern Lhasa periods identified themselves with him, particularly in their relationship to Inanna. Dumuzi's possibly quite humble origins may explain why he, contrary to his wife Inanna, never rose to the rank of a major deity, rather than being a deified celestial body such as the moon god Nana Swen, or in fact Inanna Ishtar in her Venus aspect. Dumuzi is first and foremost a shepherd, which is a decidedly human profession, which only arose after humans had learned to domesticate and stock breed animals. His lesser divinity, so to speak, may also account for the fact that we only know of 2 temples dedicated to him, one in Batibira and one in Girsu, active from the middle of the 3rd through the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. It was Raphael Kutscher who has collected the limited textual evidence for official Dumuzi cults, contending that it was confined to relatively few locations in the 3rd and early 2nd millennium, and this all came to an end in the Old Babylonian period. That, of course, doesn't mean that popular veneration of Dumuzi in festivals and mourning rites ceased. Otherwise, it'd be quite difficult to explain why we still have a month named after him, Tammuz. The relative scarcity of official textual records, as well as the dearth of clear and unambiguous iconographic material, contrast with the rich and diverse literary and cultic sources, which I will talk a bit about in my survey, which I'm now going to start chronologically. In the Farah period, Dumuzi is not apparently known as Dumuzi at all, but under his name as Ama Ushungal and variants thereof. Under these variants of Ama Ushungal, he is both attested in god lists from Farah, which you see here under its ancient name Shurupak, and in literary texts as well. Here you have pictures of the great god list from Farah, where you have Inanna very prominently in third position, but Ama Ushungal is not included at all, at least not in the preserved sections. Whether he existed somewhere in the lost sections, we do not know. He is attested in the smaller Farah god lists, which are copies by schoolboys, where he is always in the same position here in the red square. These tablets, interestingly, do not include Inanna. So while they are never combined in a kind of context of god lists in the Farah period, we do have several literary texts, and amongst them the so-called Ama Ushungal myth, known both in Ebla in Syria and in Tel Abu Salabih. In this Ama Ushungal myth, which you see here in the Ebla copy, Ama Ushungal, he is mentioned several times, but I've indicated his name once, appears indeed in connection with Inanna. And even though the text in its entirety is quite difficult to understand, one thing of notice is that he appears in this box here under his epithet friend of Enlil, Inanna's father, which he also has in the Old Babylonian period. Other than this tiny piece of continuity, the mythology contained in this text and other texts seems to be rather different from what we know from later periods, which generally seems to be the case with these early texts. In the early dynastic period, in the city-state of Lagash-Gesu, we have the cult of a certain Lugal Urukar, who is a local variant of Ama Ushungal. We know that because there is a month named after him, which is later renamed as month of Dumuzi. And a further piece of evidence is the fact that this Lugal Urukar, the lord of this possibly cultic space within the city-state of Lagash-Gesu, is referred to as the beloved husband of Inanna in Eannatum's famous Stele of Vultures. Moreover, Eannatum's nephew Enmetina records the building or rebuilding of a temple called Imush for actually both Inanna and Ushungal, which you see here on this beautiful nail and in the copy next to it. So from this we can infer that Lugal Emush, the lord of the Emush temple, is another local name for Dumuzi Ama Ushungal. There is actually a hymn ascribed to Sargon's daughter Enheduanna, which is dedicated to this temple, which is located in Bat-Tibira, so slightly to the south west of Lagash-Gesu. And this hymn, which we only know from Old Babylonian manuscripts, mainly consists of allusions to the sexual union between Dumuzi and Inanna. The temple Emush still exists in the Old Babylonian period, but what we do not know is whether the hymn to the temple and its divine occupant still had a cultic function during the early 2nd millennium, perhaps the collection of temple hymns ascribed to Enkiduana at that time mainly had some kind of antiquarian interests by the scribes who studied them. But I'm skipping ahead. What's possibly most interesting about references to Dumuzi and Inanna during the Sargonic and Gutian periods is that for the first time we find Ama Ushumgal and Dumuzi equated, and Dumuzi clearly is a name that refers to this particular deity. In Umma, there is a festival and a month dedicated to him. Perhaps there was also a temple, we don't presently know, but perhaps we will find out once the new texts from the Iraqi excavations have been studied. Maybe there is some reference, particularly in a text found in the Shara temple, so we can wait. Moreover, Dumuzi's cult is attested in Adab, Uruk, and Batibira. So again, it's very much located down here in the Sumerian south. Although Sargon's daughter Enkiduana is supposed to have composed or compiled these temple hymns, one of them about the Imush of Dumuzi in Batibira, we don't have any texts on actual manuscripts from that period that would be of literary quality or give us any insights into the mythology. So whether the sexual union celebrated in the temple hymn was already sung at that time, we cannot really tell. We also don't know if, for instance, the big Ama Ushumgal myth known from several hundred years earlier was still known or underwent any changes. The only evidence we have is from 2600 BCE. One thing that we do know from the relatively few sources from the Sargonic periods is that a certain Urgigira of Uruk describes himself as the Shagina, which was perhaps the governor or general of Dumuzi, and that may be evidence that the rulers of the Uruk IV dynasty considered themselves somehow representatives of Dumuzi as we find it in other sources. In the O3 period, it seems that the veneration of Dumuzi was relatively widespread in the populace, as we have quite a lot of personal names with Dumuzi as the theophoric element. As regards the official sphere, we have a good documentation for a Dumuzi temple at Girsu, which is not known from later periods. Offerings to Dumuzi are also recorded in Nippur, Kuara, Adab, Batibira, Ur, and Uruk, even though there may not have been proper temples dedicated to Dumuzi at these cities. These official offerings at least attest to some sort of official recognition. The month of Dumuzi is attested in the calendars of Umma and Lagash. And these months are named after festivals being celebrated during that time. And it's quite interesting to see that they don't describe the same month. Rather, the festival of Dumuzi was celebrated in Umma in spring, whereas in Lagash, the Dumuzi festival took place in late summer. This may suggest that the spring festival was a rather joyous occasion, perhaps with a sacred marriage rite, perhaps simply some sort of spring rites, and that the one celebrated in summer may have contained mourning rites and wailing over Dumuzi's death as we know it from later periods. We furthermore have songs only known from manuscripts from the Old Babylonian period, which celebrate kings Urnama, Shogi, and Shusuen of the O3 dynasty, and which allude in more or less concrete terms to their sexual union with the goddess Inanna, suggesting that the sacred marriage rite was performed by the kings of the O3 dynasty. Here we have a short extract from the hymn Shulgi X, just to highlight what I've just presented. Here, Shulgi, who is significantly called the shepherd, dresses up in order to meet Inanna, and Inanna is very much pleased at his sight and erupts in song, herself talking about how she got ready to meet Shulgi, how she bathed and put on makeup, and then they describe the sexual intercourse, and finally, because he has treated her tenderly, she too will show his favor, and indeed she proceeds to decree a favorable destiny for Shulgi, showing that this ritual union, whether concrete or just commemorated in song, between the king as a Dumuzi, who you see mentioned here in the center, and Inanna ensures fertility and prosperity for the country. The same, there we go. The most detailed and again highly literary account of the sacred marriage is found in the hymn to Inanna for Idin-dagan of Isin, which suggests that this rite was still practiced during the 20th century BCE. In this text, of which you see one manuscript here, it is stated very clearly that it was performed on the new year, so it was clearly a spring rite. It's also very clear that the king takes on the role of Dumuzi ama Ushumgalana, but it's never really explicitly stated who, if this was indeed performed in the palace, who performs the role of Inanna. Possibly a priestess, but the texts, and I think this is quite significant, always claim it is the goddess herself. And after this night of lovemaking, there is a festival for the new year, which I've here taken a short extract from. I've chosen this passage because it illustrates very beautifully the parallelism and the identification of the king and Dumuzi, here appearing under the name of Ama Ushumgalana, because we have two completely parallel lines with the king and Ama Ushumgalana being used interchangeably. And the passage describing the food and the drink and the joyous mood and the abundance that ensues from this ritual union the night before. It's scattered with references to both the king, royal thrones, and references to Ama Ushumgalana. So again, we have this rite ensuring fertility and prosperity, and it was not just Idin-dagan, but also his successor Ishme-dagan has several hymns alluding to his sexual union with the goddess Inanna. It seems the sacred marriage rite was not performed by the Hammurabi dynasty, and the only remaining Dumuzi temple in Batibira disappears after Samsu-iluna, who's Hammurabi's successor. So although this ritual practice stopped, we still have many copies of literary texts referring to the sacred marriage from scribal schools of the 18th century. These tablets written by schoolboys during their training provide us with the most detailed information about the divine couple Inanna and Dumuzi that we have for any period of Mesopotamian history. There are about 30 quite diverse cultic songs in which Inanna and the shepherd Dumuzi feature as young lovers who enjoy the courtship period and eventually get married. And they have a very joyous, carefree, and often bucolic setting. And are sometimes really so charming and seemingly mundane that one might forget that the lovers are divine. In epics about legendary early kings, the identification of the rulers with Inanna's lover is transported back into the earliest times, especially in the one about the rivalry between Enmerkara of Uruk and in Sukukeshtana, the lord of Aratta, somewhere on the Iranian highland. These two rulers, they engage in a competition, which of course the Sumerian king wins, thus gaining the favors of Inanna for Sumer. And as in the sacred marriage rites detailed in these hymns I was talking about earlier, again, the relations between Inanna and the king ensure prosperity for the entire country. The myths are very different in nature because in these Dumuzi is a tragic young man haunted by demons, captured and dragged off to the netherworld. The range of perspectives from which this is told is absolutely fascinating and, to my knowledge, quite unique for Sumerian literature. Usually in Sumerian literature, you have one clear hero with whom the audience is invited to identify, and there is no countertext that sides with the defeated enemy or rival. It's always only one perspective. Yet this does not seem to be the case with the Inanna Dumuzi narratives. The most well-known text is, of course, Inanna's descent to the netherworld. It tells the story of how Inanna intended to take control of the netherworld, failed, and was rescued thanks to a trick devised by the cunning god Enki, and thus was able to return to Earth. However, as you know, she has to deliver a substitute that goes to the netherworld in her stead, and she picks Dumuzi because he failed to mourn her during her absence. Dumuzi tries to escape, but is ultimately captured by demons. And finally, Inanna decides he should share his fate with his faithful sister, Geshtinanna, each spending half a year in the netherworld and half a year above ground. The myth has been interpreted in many, many ways, but the approach that I find the most convincing is that originally the text explained the movements of the planet Venus and her disappearance and eventual reappearance in the sky. And the original story actually ended with Inanna's rescue and coming back above ground. It was then combined with a different tradition, according to which her lover Dumuzi is captured by demons and abducted to the netherworld. In order for this combination of two narrative materials to work out, a reason for Inanna's decision has to be found. It needs to be explained why, of all options, Inanna essentially sentences her lover to death. So Dumuzi, in this version of the myth, is said to have behaved disrespectfully in her absence and possibly even having committed adultery with Inanna's maid. Inanna's anger at Dumuzi's betrayal thus suggests that her death sentence is justified by Dumuzi's guilt. So the audience, the way it's told, the audience definitely sides with Inanna. However, different traditions about Dumuzi's capture by demons continue to be transmitted in writing alongside Inanna's descent to the netherworld. And there we indeed have several texts. Most poignantly, Dumuzi's dream, which tell the episode from Dumuzi's own perspective. Dumuzi's in these texts appears to be completely innocent. There is no guilt on his part. In most of them, Inanna isn't involved at all. And the audience clearly is invited to identify with Dumuzi and pity him, because it really seems rather unfair that he is kidnapped by the demons. Only in Dumuzi in Inanna, which is only currently known from 2 manuscripts from Ur, only in this story is Inanna guilty and somehow involved in Dumuzi's death. It's closer to the version in Inanna's descent. Since the texts focusing on Dumuzi's bitter fate are mainly, with the exception of Dumuzi's dreams, attested in only very, very few copies, I'm somehow tempted to consider these diverging traditions as existence of a once very lively oral transmission centering around the tragic figure of Dumuzi. The complex and composite structure of Inanna's descent, which necessitated the introduction of some guilt on Dumuzi's part to rationalize Inanna's behavior, apparently could not completely suppress the possibly earlier traditions, which just knew Dumuzi as a tragic but innocent figure. This is also how he is represented in the liturgical literature, which laments his disappearance and death. There he is also innocent and killed in his prime. For constraints of time, I will skip ahead and present the remaining half of Mesopotamian history in very sweeping fashion. As I've mentioned before, we have no more Dumuzi temples after the Old Babylonian period. There is a small cella in Ashur, but not a proper temple. There is some evidence for offerings and rites in the context of the capturing of Dumuzi, and in fact, still in the Seleucid period, the 4th month of the year, which is called Du'uzu, which comes from Dumuzi, is explained as the month of the capture of Dumuzi. And around this motif of the capture and disappearance of Dumuzi, we also still have several cultic lamentations, which are still being performed to lament his death. Dumuzi and Inanna are also mentioned occasionally in rituals and incantations. There they usually represent the iconic married couple, and they're quite happy. Noteworthy are 3 cuneiform tablets containing the Akkadian myth Ishtar's descent to the netherworld, which is a highly abridged version of the Sumerian myth Inanna's descent, shortened so drastically that it is sometimes nearly incomprehensible. And it's really interesting to note that this text is not like some other Sumerian myths transmitted in a bilingual version with the complete Sumerian text preserved and interlinear Akkadian translation. Rather, this really is an independent text, even though it is dependent on the earlier Sumerian composition. Apart from the drastic shortening, certain thematic innovations can be observed. So it's also given a slightly different nuances occasionally. Just to mention one of them, which has been pointed out several times, namely that Ishtar's disappearance from Earth in the Akkadian version is linked to a complete end of fertility, which is an aspect that is completely absent from the earlier Sumerian version. So it seems as if the text no longer explains in a very straightforward way Ishtar's movements as the planet Venus, but rather focuses on the seasonal cycle connected to human and animal reproduction. Let me sum up. The official cult of Dumuzi seems to be a phenomenon of the mid-3rd through the early 2nd millennium BCE. But even there, it's restricted to a couple of local centers and not very predominant. His very last mention in a royal dedicatory inscription actually is from the time of Rimsin of Lhasa around 1800 BCE, and then he no longer is mentioned in a royal inscription. The last evidence for the right of the sacred marriage, in which the ruler plays the part of Dumuzi as Inanna's lover in order to ensure prosperity for the land, comes from the Isin period, so from the 20th century BCE. And it seems that this rite was not continued under the Amorite dynasty at Babylon, just as the official cult for Dumuzi stopped during that time. This suggests that royal patronage of the official Dumuzi cult was connected to the ruler's identification with Dumuzi as Inanna's lover. And once this identification with Dumuzi was rejected and the sacred marriage rite discontinued, the official cult for Dumuzi, which was never very strong to begin with, was also neglected and soon abandoned. So this probably reflects a change in royal ideology. Kings, at least from the Hammurabi dynasty onwards, evidently did not derive at least part of their legitimation from Dumuzi, and this may indeed be some sort of deliberate break with the Sumerian tradition, also exemplified by the Sumerian king list, which has this narrative of a never-ending string of successive kings, starting with two enigmatic Dumuzi figures before real historical times and extending all the way into the present. At the Old Babylonian scribal schools, which were devoted to upholding the Sumerian legacy, the different roles of Dumuzi were kept alive just a bit longer, even though the texts that the schoolboys copied may have no longer played a very important cultic role and perhaps were studied for antiquarian interests. Thus, the epic of Enmerkara and Ensukukeshtana preserved the notion of rulers being married to Inanna. The cultic songs celebrated Dumuzi and Inanna as young lovers, and hymns to rulers of the third dynasty of Ur, like Shogi, and the Isin dynasty, like Idindagan, who seem to have performed the sacred marriage rite, were copied by schoolboys, just like the myths around Inanna and Dumuzi as a tragic couple. So the scribal curriculum of the Old Babylonian period provides the last evidence for the two roles of Dumuzi, once the young shepherd identified with the king and the wooing, and finally the marrying of Inanna, and then the tragic young lad who is captured by demon and taken captive in the netherworld. As Dumuzi loses his association with the king during the Old Babylonian period, his second role, namely that of the tragic young boy being captured and disappearing from Earth, becomes more predominant. Several lamentations around Dumuzi's death are attested from the Old Babylonian period onwards and continued to be performed in the first millennium. And only the Neo-Assyrian manuscripts of the descent of Ishtar prove that some of the Sumerian mythological material survived, although it was given new nuances. The tradition of Dumuzi being Inanna's spouse was essentially restricted to rituals and incantations in later periods. So despite the fact that the official cult for Dumuzi stopped during the early second millennium, it is conceivable, in my opinion, that popular cults bewailing his death in summer continued, which is also indirectly suggested by the fact that a summer month is still named after him in the first millennium, which continues to this day. While Inanna Ishtar always retained her role as essentially the most important female deity of the Mesopotamian pantheon, Dumuzi's fate was connected to changing concepts of kingship lending further support to his assumed human origin as a deified king. Perhaps because people, being mortal themselves, could identify with his tragic fate, and that might be the reason why Dumuzi, in all likelihood, continued to be important in popular religion even after he lost the royal patronage of the official cult. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jana, for this valuable information. And now let me to translate abstract about your lecture for my students.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. طلبتنا الأعزاء السادة الباحثين، نقدم لكم ملخص لما قدمته الباحثة في محاضرتها الموسومة بإنانا ودوموزي بين الأسطورة والطقوس العبادة الرسمية والدين الشعبي. وهنا في هذه المحاضرة تطرقت الباحثة إلى الآلهة إنانا والإله تموز، وتطرقت إلى الحب والزواج وإلى الطقوس والتعاويذ ومنها النقوش الملكية. كذلك تطرقت إلى موت دموزي وقصة الحب بين إنانا ودموزي خلال الفترات، وابتدأت من الفترة السرجونية والفترة البابلية القديمة الألفية الثانية والأولى، وأيضا تطرقت إلى ما تناقلته النصوص الرسمية عن العبادة الرسمية لممارسة الطقوس الدينية الشعبية. وهناك أيضا تطرقت إلى الألواح الفنية التي جسد فيها الإله دموزي. هناك لوحة طينية من العصر البابلي القديم ومن فترة موقع فارا الذي يعود إلى فترة 2600 إلى 2500 قبل الميلاد. كذلك دموزي عرف تحت اسم دينجر أما أشومقال ودينجر أما أشوم ودينجر أما أشوم أنا. كذلك هناك لوح يعود إلى الكاهنة انخدوانا ابنة سرجون الأكدي والتي تعود إلى، وهذه المخطوطة في الأسطر من 210 إلى 220 والتي ذكر فيها اسم الإله دموسي دينجر أما أشومقال أن، والذي يقابله بدينجر دموزي. كما اقترن اسم دموزي في مواقع مثل موقع مدينة أمة الذي يقع في محافظة ذي قار، وذكر في تقويم مدينة أمة أحد الأشهر ذكر فيها الإله دموزي، وكذلك ذكر في مدينة أداب ومدينة أوروك. كذلك كان هناك الاسم ذكر في مدينة الوركاس الوركا الرابعة في حكم الملك أورغش جيجر، والذي كان شاقينا جبرنر دينجر دموزي ديما وتموز. أما في فترة أور الثالثة هناك العديد من الأسماء الشخصية التي اقترنت مع الإله دموزي ومعبد دموزي أيضا في مدينة قرصو وفي مدينة أداب وباتبيرا وأور وأوروك. كذلك هناك في تقويم مدينة لقش كان هناك الشهر السادس في أحد تقويم أيضا اقترنا باسم الإله دموزي وهو أواخر الصيف، وفي مدينة أمة هو الشهر 12 والذي يمثل الربيع، وأيضا ذكر الزواج المقدس. وأيضا كان هناك معابد للإله دموزي استمرت من منتصف الألف الثالث إلى الألف الثاني، وكذلك هناك طقوس الزواج المقدس، وهناك شخصيتين مثلت تموز منه الراعي وهو الشاب يتطابق مع الملك الذي يتزوج من الإله إنانا، والفتى الشاب الذي تأسره الشياطين وتنزله إلى العالم السفلي. هذا ملخص ما تقدمت به الباحثة الدكتورة جانا ماتوشاك، وشكرا جزيلا. الآن نفتح باب الأسئلة لمن لديه سؤال. Now we will open the question. If you have any question, you can open the mic directly. Thank you. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, here you are.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. That was really good, and I learned a great deal. What is the meaning of the name Ama Ushumgal? And how does he become Dumuzi?
I think I can answer the first part, not necessarily the second part of the question.
Okay.
The way Krabenik explains these names, which correspond to a relatively typical type, we have Ushumgal as a component of personal names, also in other combinations. Ama, of course, means mother, and Ushumgal, well, it can mean this kind of dragon, snake monster, but essentially conveys the notion of power and strength. So Krabenik, and I think that's quite convincing, interprets the name as something like the mother is strong or powerful. One problem that previous scholars had with this name is that Ama clearly refers to a female person. So they've tried various different tricks to make it work for a clearly male figure, but Krabenik, with drawing evidence from other personal names from the early and mid 3rd millennium, could compare it to similar statements about the king being strong, the brother being strong, and these are essentially statements about family members and not so much about the person who carries the name. So he would be called after, or his name would be praise of a very strong mother. Similar name types that he compares to Ama Ushumgal are, again, either titles and professions like Lugal, or family members like Nin for sister and Shesh for brother, being likened to other nouns like lal, honey or syrup, meaning something positive, sweet, good. So many of these names apparently had the same kind of composite nature of someone is like this. And that's how he interprets the name Ama Ushumgalana. What is a lot more difficult to explain is how Ama Ushumgalana or Ama Ushumgal became Dumuzi. Krabenik contends that the Dumuzi that is mentioned in early and mid 3rd millennium sources, definitely in the Lagash-Girsu area, refers to a different deity, namely to Dumuzi, Dumuzi Abzu, what's her name? God, now I forget, which is a female deity connected to Enki and the kind of Apsu area. She is mentioned also in various Gudea inscriptions, and apparently that's how Krabenik interprets the evidence. These early mentions of Dumuzi are an abbreviated form of this female deity having Dumuzi as part of the name. What we see in the 3rd millennium is that we have many different lovers and beloved husbands of Inanna. So we have to apparently account for several different local figures who later become syncretized. So we have this Lugal Emush in essentially named after his temple. We have this Lugal Urukar, where we don't even know how to read the second sign. And we have Ama Ushumgal, who at least is known in places like Farah and Ebla. So that's a much wider geographical radius. Where Dumuzi in this particular function comes from, we don't really know, but one of the earliest direct equations of Dumuzi and Ama Ushumgal is in the Utuhengal victory stele, where it's one name, it's like a double name, giving us evidence for the syncretism of these possibly originally separate deities with a similar function in the early, in the Sagonic period.
Thank you very much. That was a very good answer. Thank you.
Thank you دكتور مايك. السادة الحضور أرجو غلق المايكات. المايك يعني يأثر على الباحث. أرجو غلق المايكات إذا تسمحون. نعم. أكو
والله دمج اسمك عبال وقعت تدري.
رجاء غلق المايكات. Another question, please. If you have any question, you can open the mic. دكتور أحمد عزيز. تفضل دكتور. تفضل دكتور أحمد عزيز.
السلام عليكم دكتور أبو عذاب.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله. حياك الله دكتور. شرفتنا.
ولا أثمن لك جهودك في نشر المعرفة العلمية الحضارية التي تزيد من تلك الجهود التي من شأنها تعزز وتعلي شأن حضارة بلاد الرافدين. شكرا لك ولكل الجهود المبذولة مع زملائنا الآخرين، وشكرا للباحثة جانا على هذه المحاضرة الرائعة. وأود أن أسأل المحاضرة الأستاذة جانا، واسمح لي أن أقدم سؤالي باللغة الإنجليزية لو سمحت دكتور.
حياكم الله دكتور. شرفني دكتور. حياكم الله. تفضل دكتور.
Mrs. Jana, thank you very much for your lectures. I'm Dr. Ahmed Ibrahimi, archaeologist, PhD in archaeology of ancient Mesopotamia. I work in Babylon department. I'm interested in your fine lecture about Dumuzi and Ishtar, and I would like to cover my question, which are the following. My question is, are there references in the cuneiform texts in the modern Babylonian period that refer to the goddess Ishtar and god Dumuzi, especially since there are rituals for holy marriage in Babylonian New Year celebrations of Akita? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very nice to meet you. If I understood your question correctly, you were asking about the sacred marriage rite in later periods. We don't really have much evidence for the sacred marriage between Dumuzi and Inanna or Ishtar after the 20th century, the very early second millennium BCE. We have certain love rituals and love triangles with different deities, especially Marduk, Ishtar, and Sarpanitam. And we have evidence for New Year festivities in later periods, but they do not involve Inanna and Dumuzi. So if we did have a certain kind of ritual performance between the king and possibly a priestess representing Inanna. That seems to be a phenomenon connected with Sumerian times. We seem to have some evidence for the third dynasty of Ur, especially Shulgi, perhaps also later. And in Isin, the Isin kings in the 20th century emulated the Ur III kings in many ways, but it seems that was completely abandoned. I hope I have answered your question.
رجاء المايك سادة الحضور، رجاء المايك غلقوا المايك رجاء، يعني جاي يأثر على الصوت. Thank you, Jana. My student,
Thank you very much, دكتور جانا، and شكرا جزيلا أستاذنا الفاضل دكتور أبو ذر على هذه المحاضرة. بارك الله فيكم.
حياكم الله دكتور، حياكم الله، شرفنا دكتور. الله يحفظكم. Dr. Jana, another question to my student, Asil Arak. She asked you, are you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Her question, was Dumuzi a worthy king or a god when the first of the husband of God Inanna in the sacred marriage ritual, and that he remained a god throughout the age of this day?
I think I understand the last part of your question. Could you very quickly repeat it, please? I'm very sorry, I couldn't hear it.
Yeah. Was Dumuzi a worldly king or a god when the priests of the city of Warka choosing him to be the husband of God Inanna or remained a god throughout the age to the days?
That is a very good question, and again, difficult to answer. I think the hypothesis that the deity Dumuzi may have originally been a king, a very early king who was later deified, is quite plausible, partly because his names seem to be common names for human people in the early third millennium, and partly because we have similar literary traditions about early kings being deified, such as Gilgamesh or Lugalbanda. I think once Dumuzi falls in love with Ishtar and starts bringing her family presents and wants to marry her, he is considered divine, and he is always written with the divine determinative, which is a very clear sign of his divinity. And he was also included in some of the god lists already in the Phara period, so in the mid-3rd millennium BCE. However, what is interesting is that there are still certain traces in the text that refer to his not entirely divine nature. So in the love songs in which he tries to convince Inanna and her family that he is a suitable husband for Inanna, he tries to defend his family background and asserts that he's also a god And in Dumuzi's dream, where he is about to be captured by demons, he prays to the sun god Utu, saying, "Please help me. You are my brother-in-law. I am not a mortal. I am not a human. I am a god. I am the husband of Inanna." So no other god in the pantheon would say, "I'm not a human. I am a god. I am included by marriage into the pantheon." This very necessity for this kind of argumentation seems to contrain some traces that he may have first been human and then later deified. But from the moment we have textual sources, from the mid-3rd millennium, he is considered a god who can be killed, though.
Yeah, thank you. Another question, Dr. Belhar Snyder or Dr. Mauro Viano, if you have any questions.
Yes, that would be a question.
Yeah, here you are.
Hello, thank you for the talk. Firstly, I was not aware that Dumuzi names were still frequent in your free times. And now to my question, could it be that the 2 consecutive streams you pointed out, the celestial movement and the seasonal change, existed simultaneously already at an early time?
That's possible. The idea that Inanna's descent is connected to Venus' movements comes from the text itself, because when Inanna goes to the netherworld and the doorkeeper asks her, "What are you doing here?" she says, "I am Inanna going east." So she gives a very good excuse, which is something she does every night. So this may be an explanation, because the Venus obviously has this double nature of being the evening star and the morning star, and in between she's invisible. And then there is also a kind of periodic disappearance of Venus, which happens every 580 days or so. But I think it's more likely to quite basically refer to the fact that she appears in the evening and then she reappears in the morning. She appears just after sunset and then she disappears and she's reborn just before sunrise. The later Ishtar myth describes how after she goes to the netherworld, animals don't procreate anymore, and humans don't entertain sexual relations. And there it's quite clear, but this is not described at all in the Sumerian myth. There is no reference to the stop in sexual activities. However, because Dumuzi is a deity connected with animal husbandry, etc., and seems to die in summer when milk production ceases, I think the minute these 2 traditions are combined, the minute we have this composite myth of Inanna going to the netherworld and then Dumuzi going to the netherworld, I think that is when this fertility aspect is introduced.
And you don't think that Dumuzi the shepherd is also such a hint for that? In the Sumerian king list?
Absolutely. Also the fact that the king is the one who is responsible for prosperity of his people, right? And the fact that he gets this once a year, possibly for the new year, with Inanna, definitely is connected to that as well.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, another question. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah, here you are.
Yeah, thank you, Jana. Thank you very much for your nice talk. You claim that elements from the narrative of Dumuzi's death were incorporated into the myth of Inanna descent. And what is the level of intertextuality between Inanna Descent and then the other Dumuzi's texts?
Well, the motive of the demons finding Dumuzi, haunting him, finding him in the steppe where he is herding his animals, the prayer and the attempt to escape are also present in both texts. And finally, his sister Inanna makes an appearance in both texts. This is very reduced in Inanna's Descent. She appears at the very end when Inanna, somehow out of nowhere decides that brother and sister should share this fate of going down. Whereas in Dumuzi's dream, she's the one where Dumuzi hides, and she's the one, even though she's being tortured by demons, who doesn't disclose her brother's whereabouts, etc. So they have a different function, but I think the fact that Inanna chooses Inanna as sharing the fate of her brother also alludes to her persona as being a faithful sister who self-sacrifices for her brother and who tries to bear his bane. So I think there is quite an amount of intertextuality. What I have not studied is in how far we can pin it down to similar phrases and terminology, but it would definitely something be worthy of further study. I'm not the first to suggest this. This actually has been suggested by Dina Katz many years ago when she tried to outline in her opinion, 4 different sections of Inanna Descent. But I think it's quite plausible and a good explanation for this introduction of Dumuzi's guilt, which is not found in any of the other Dumuzi narratives.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question? Another question? My student Zahra Sachet asked her about what's the main aim for the story between Dumuzi and Ishtar love. Is that for the conflict between the life and the death?
That's, if I understand it correctly, that's also a very interesting question. It seems a bit as if the 2 different roles of Dumuzi are difficult to reconcile. In the songs, there is complete bliss and happiness between the young lovers. And this fact that they stay a married couple is present elsewhere, especially in love incantations and the Ishtar Dumuzi rituals, which Walter Faber has edited. There they appear as the archetypal lover couple, and there is no suggestion of this ending at any point. But possibly what Bernhard Schneider asked about, this kind of connection of Dumuzi to at least animal fertility, and in later periods, perhaps also general fertility extended to plants and everything, and the seasonal cycle, which consists of death and rebirth constantly. That seemed to have introduced a certain element of tragedy, which may have been somehow ingrained in Dumuzi's figure from the beginning. And you could even go so far as to claim that the composition, or the kind of composition in the sense of creating this composite nature of Inanna's descent was an attempt to reconcile this, because then you can put this into a kind of chronology where you have the happiness of youth, and then Inanna goes off on her own. In the meantime, Dumuzi betrays her and thus is sentenced to death, which then explains his cyclical disappearance. But in all of the other sources, these two aspects of happy couple and Dumuzi being killed by demons exist side by side.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Dr. Francisco, if you have any question. Dr. Francisco? Okay, Dr. Jana, I have a question. The king of Dumuzi firstly ruled in Batebera or in Uruk?
Yeah, this is a difficult question. In the Sumerian king list, we have two Dumuzis, strangely, and they have different professions. One is a shepherd and one is a fisherman, which doesn't appear elsewhere. And it has troubled people to decide which is the Dumuzi that we know from later periods, which is the kind of alleged ancestor of this deity. The one in Uruk is the fisherman, and that has caused most problems because clearly in later periods, Dumuzi has not much to do with fish. I cannot explain why we have two legendary kings of that name and how they relate to each other. And I would not decide which one is the one we're after. I remain completely agnostic about that. And obviously, these very early sections of the Sumerian king list are not to be taken as historical fact. Rather, I would interpret the very fact that we have kings called Dumuzi in the king list as some kind of memory of the fact that Dumuzi is not a divine name, but a personal name. So it may have been, there may have been a person called that somewhere at the very beginnings of history. And this may have been the kind of matrix for this later divinity, which was, at least by the Sumerians, associated with kingship. But the exact development, I think, is impossible to reconstruct.
Okay, thank you, Jana, for this all available information. And in the end of our lecture today, I would like to express my deep thanks for your wonderful lecture. And I would like to thank for all my colleagues that attending to our lecture. And I hope to meet in the future, in the next of the lecture. Thank you so much, and good night. If you have,
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a huge pleasure and honor to present to you tonight. And I also look forward to future papers by colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then thank you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Good night. Good night.